مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. في عالم السياسة لعب دونالد ترامب وفق قواعده الخاصة، فبعد أمر من التبرعات السياسية للساسة من كلا الحزبين ترشح للرئاسة بصفته جمهوريا، وفي الوقت نفسه لم يتردد في الخروج على الأفكار التقليدية للحزب حول كل من السياسة الخارجية والداخلية. عارض اتفاقيات التجارة الحرة وانتقد الناتو، والتحدث بحرارة عن الرئيس الروسي فلاديمير بوتين، وهذه ليست من نقاط حوار الجمهوريين التقليدية. كذلك ولا التعهد بإنفاق مليارات الدولارات على مشاريع الأشغال العامة أو ضمان التأمين الصحي للكل. الآن وقد صار في البيت الأبيض يصح أن نسأل ما حقيقة إيديولوجية دونالد ترامب المتمردة، وكيف ستؤثر على مستقبل الحزب الذي بفضل نجاحه يسيطر الآن على كلا مجلسي الكونغرس. لمناقشة الصلة بين ترامب المنظر وترامب الجمهوري وترامب السياسة الشعبوي، يسرني أن أرحب بلجنتنا هذا الأسبوع من الخبراء السياسيين، والتي تضم توم روغان وتيم كارني. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Today we're going to discuss the ideas and ideology of Donald J. Trump, America's new president. What motivates his thinking? Is he a Republican, and how do Republicans view what he does think? I'm delighted to have two panelists today who've given a lot of thought to what he thinks. That's Tom Rogan and Tim Carney. Thank you very much for joining us today on Dakhel, Washington. So let's begin with the beginning. How would you define Donald Trump's ideology?
Populism is the best word to describe Donald Trump's ideology. He's not a conservative like most Republicans are. He had been a Democrat. Some would have called him a liberal Democrat, putting him on the left. But the best word to describe him is populism, meaning that he sort of ran against Washington, D.C., against the ruling class in this country, and on behalf of what he called the forgotten man, the people who he thought had been left behind by politics. So some of his policies line up on the left, more line up on the right. But if you think of him as a populist, I think that's the best way to think.
Populism, is that an ideology?
I think, well, he's made it an ideology, certainly, for himself in the United States, and it is a revolution, and I think it's attested by the fact when Donald Trump was elected, he was able to bring in a lot of Democrats who previously voted for Barack Obama, especially in states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, traditional what were known as blue states or democratic states. He was able to do that because of his populist message on a number of issues. I think trade would be the big one there, personally, that was my opinion. But if you look at his base in the Republican Party, the conservative element of American politics, it is vested in a quite sort of broad base of people, and it's not vested in a base of people, right? There are a lot of Republicans who don't like Mr. Trump. So his support is defined by his persona more than any politician I think we've seen in a long time.
All right, so then what one line or two lines stood out for you from the inaugural address that reflects the ideas you're talking about?
Well, when Trump spoke about how he was taking power to the people from Washington, that I think was the populist idea there, that he was saying there's too much power kind of up here on the stage with me, because he was surrounded by all the members of Congress, former presidents, and he wanted to return it out to the people in the country. That's an idea that, again, I think echoes the populism. And when I would go around the country to talk to voters, the main thing they said was sort of, Washington doesn't have our interests in mind. It's all a group of insiders enriching themselves, and Trump is actually going to stand up for the regular guy. So when he said we're going to take power from Washington to the regular people, I thought that was the best encapsulation of his populism.
Do most Trump voters, in your view, think that there's really carnage out there in America?
Well, I don't know that most. I mean, look, Trump has a lot of supporters in rural areas that I think focal issues, again, trade, immigration, the notion of the economy being made better is the pivotal issue. But I think there is a broad perception across the country that there is this idea of instability, chaos. I think maybe he's actually appealing to some inner city voters there who might be. I think he has an opportunity, actually, quite frankly, on things like Chicago, where there is sort of high crime rates, to bring in some Democratic voters. I think going back to that inauguration speech, the big line that stood out to me was the concluding line, and yes, we are going to make America great again, which was his campaign slogan. And that stood out to me because it showed that the President Trump, to a lot, or to a significant degree of the campaign Trump, is going to sustain, right? That the candidate Trump, who talked about these slogans, these populist narratives, is going to sustain throughout the presidency. And I think it was a warning shot to Republicans and perhaps the establishment, and also Democrats who were hoping that perhaps Trump won't reach out more to Democrats and undercut that base, that he's going to keep doing what he's been doing, that populism will define his presidency.
Okay. So when you think about the inauguration and already the early decisions that he has made, what was the most traditional Republican thing that Donald Trump has said or done? Why don't you go first?
I think his focus on regulatory reform and what we've seen in the first couple of weeks was sitting down with CEOs from major American corporations in very different industries. I think that's something that immediately galvanizes most Republicans across the board, and because Republicans, conservatives tend to be more pro-business. But the idea of regulatory reform specifically, cutting regulations in the belief that that will foster a more successful employment market and a more successful economy, more successful investment, that is something that unifies Republicans. To me, that is his sort of, okay, I'm ticking this establishment box.
Mm-hmm. And another big thing for the average Republican voter is the abortion issue, and the U.S. government funds lots of family planning things around the world, and so Donald Trump did what the previous Republican presidents had done on their first day, which is say none of this family planning money will go to organizations that fund abortion. And so that, it's called the Mexico City policy, reinstating that on day one, just like George W. Bush did, and just like Ronald Reagan put it in. That is him saying, look, even though Trump wasn't a pro-lifer himself, he wasn't an abortion opponent, he followed in the footsteps. He did what the party wanted him to do. So that, I thought, was one of the most interesting changes, because you know that Trump deep down hasn't been on the pro-life side of the abortion issue for a long time, but he gave the pro-life base what he could give them on day one.
Okay, so you've identified one thing for the, say, fiscal conservatives, one thing for the social conservatives. We're going to come back to them from their views in just a minute. If these are the traditional Republican things that he has done, what would you identify as the least traditional things? Not that he has said, but the least traditional Republican things that he has done since coming into the Oval Office.
Well, so on trade is the issue where I think he deviates most from most Republicans, where the standard issue there is we need free and open trade. Economists agree this makes the whole world richer. Most people think generally this enriches the U.S. But if he's talking to, Tom was referring to Michigan, Pennsylvania, there's a lot of factories that closed down and moved to Mexico. If he's talking to the people who lost their job there, he takes a more protectionist stance. And so he named as his commerce secretary a man named Wilbur Ross, who was a Democrat, very successful businessman, who has said we need an economy more like China that is very planned and that supports the big businesses. So that's something that Obama would talk about, but it's even sort of further to the left of Obama. So I think that trade talk, and sometimes with where he talks about putting in tariffs still, we're not sure what he'll do, but all that anti-free trade talk certainly deviates from what Paul Ryan or George W. Bush, Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House, former President Bush, what they did.
Anti-free trade.
Yes.
Would you agree with that?
I 100% agree with Tim on that, and I think it really reaches back to that idea of the Trump brand, the populism that is sort of very different to previous presidents. He's trying to appeal to this broader base. And yes, I think, Tim makes the point that, frankly, I should have done more traveling in the campaign, but where I did travel and I did go to Pennsylvania a couple of times. Very, very noticeable to see, especially in small towns, not just the sense that the economy, because of these closed factories, the loss of traditional employment, that's a big impact, but how because of a lost factory, all the other local businesses in that area have lost the people from those factories spending money. So everyone suffers. And so this collapse of sort of a sense of American security in employment and economy is a big constituency for him. And both Democrats and Republicans who oppose President Trump can have a big challenge in trying to undercut that. Those people really believe in him.
Okay, so you mentioned a moment ago one of his cabinet picks, Wilbur Ross, the Secretary of Commerce. Can we say some more about his overall set of appointments? Who would you say is the most ideological appointment? And is there a message, when you put it all together, is there a message that he is sending by the types of people that he's appointing for cabinet choices?
Well, to follow up on what Tom said about him actually delivering his campaign promises, a lot of people thought he wouldn't because he was changing. He would come from all over the place. A couple things he was consistent on was sort of undoing some of the federal guidelines on education, the Common Core guidelines. Who we picked for Education Secretary, a woman, Betsy DeVos, she has been a fierce advocate of school choice, which could end up sort of bringing more local control back to education.
Just so our Middle Eastern leaders, listeners, understand what the terminology is. School choice.
So
what does that mean?
It means so that you, so that instead of just going to your local public school, the county runs or the state runs, that you might get a grant or just more decision making to pick which school you go to, whether it's a private school or a different public school or a publicly funded independent school we call charter schools. And so Betsy DeVos has been a big idea that introduces competition into education. So that's one of those biggest ones. And the other is Tom Price, Health and Human Services Secretary pick, who has been the biggest advocate of saying this is how we're going to undo President Obama's reform, Obamacare, and replace it with something else. And so those were two things that Trump ran on. Get federal government out of education and go ahead and repeal and replace Obamacare.
I would say an interesting one, especially for the viewers here, is James Mattis, who's the Defense Secretary. Because President Trump has talked a lot about the idea of, perhaps he's mentioned with Iraq, the idea of the oil, we should have kept the oil. But James Mattis is someone who is, I think a lot of viewers would be quite comforted by. He's a former Marine general, but he's someone who has quite a lot of experience, for example, with the Anbari tribes in Western Iraq, Iraqi politics, and he's also someone who I think values the idea of learning from some of the experiences of the Iraq War, that he was a combat leader there. He's known the costs of that, both in the cost to his personnel, but so he's also someone we begin to talk about the Iran deal, what might happen there. Of course, President Trump has been very negative about the Iran deal. I think James Mattis, being at that pivotal position as Defense Secretary, shows that President Trump likes James Mattis and is willing to listen to someone who is willing to, who wants to sort of take a more perhaps conservative in the idea of a more restrained approach, even though his imagery, James Mattis is known as Mad Dog. I think he's quite a sort of stable leader.
And it's a very important point about Trump is that while he has a very strong ego, he's very sure of himself, he's not firmly planted in a lot of his ideas. And so Mattis was able to convince him sort of to be less in favor of torture. Trump was saying we need to do torture, we need to waterboard and do more. And Mattis, who has this experience, told him some stories and changed Trump's mind. And so a very powerful guy who Trump respects going ahead and being in that cabinet room, that's the sort of man who could definitely change Trump's mind on foreign policy.
Okay, when we come back, we're going to shift from the messages that President Trump has been sending to how those messages have been received by key constituencies in the Republican Party and throughout the nation in just a moment. Our panelists today include Tom Rogan. Tom is an American with a British accent He's a political columnist and senior fellow at the Steamboat Institute, which defines itself as defenders of freedom and advocates of liberty. Tom is also a columnist for National Review, one of the premier journals of conservative thought in America today, a panelist on the McLaughlin Group, and a regular book reviewer for the Washington Free Beacon. His writing and broadcast commentary has appeared frequently in major media outlets here in the States and in Britain. Tim Carney, sitting to his right. Tim has served for more than 6 years as senior political columnist for the Washington Examiner newspaper. In addition, he helps direct the Culture of Competition project at the American Enterprise Institute, a major Washington think tank advocating free market economics. A former professor of journalism, Tim also previously served as editor of the influential Evans-Novak Political Report, must-reading for political junkies here in Washington. All right, gentlemen, let's look at the three conventional divisions among Republicans and see so far whether they are pleased or anxious about the direction of the early decisions and appointments of the Trump administration. All right, social conservatives, what do you think?
I think very happy. I think they're very happy with President Trump. And that's an interesting thing to say, because during the campaign, candidate Donald Trump talked about he was said many different things about lesbian and gay and transgender issues, social issues, and abortion. And so I think a lot of conservatives thought maybe when President Trump came in, he might be more to the left on those issues.
I agree. I think social conservatives have been pleasantly surprised. They were very wary. It's a man who described himself as very pro-choice, and on the campaign said he was going to be a pro-life guy. And his early actions, including Mexico City, including just some of his talk about the March for Life here in Washington, an annual event, all of that has made conservatives, pro-life, social conservatives say, wow, he's kind of one of us in the White House.
I was going to ask about the Supreme Court nominee in just a moment, but it does seem to me this pick is going to replace Antonin Scalia. So there's almost a pass, one would imagine, in appointing somebody who's on the more radical end of the spectrum. It's really the second pick that will determine Trump's legacy.
If you get a resignation of one of the four liberal justices, three liberal justices or the moderate, or I guess four liberals and a moderate on the court, if you get one of them resigning and Trump nominates a conservative, that's where you will expect a harder Democratic fight. But I don't see the Senate Democrats leader now is Chuck Schumer, senator from New York, who has defined his career fighting against Bush judges. The Democrats went from sometimes going into full war to sort of always being in full war, and Chuck Schumer was a man who led them there. So it could just be that they're ready to dig in their heels, especially because this vacancy, President Obama had named somebody, Merrick Garland, for this vacancy, and Republicans just refused to even hold a vote on him, so there could be some revenge, and anybody's going to be blocked.
All right, so let's go to the second group. First, social conservatives. What about fiscal conservatives? Are they a happy lot?
I think mixed bag at the moment. President Trump, on the area where fiscal conservatives are happy, President Trump is talking about cuts in discretionary spending, which is the spending that in any government across the world, the basic things, education, etc. They're happy about that restraint and capping the federal workforce. They're more concerned, though, and you may see a showdown here between the most powerful Republican in Congress, House Speaker Paul Ryan, and the president. They're more concerned about entitlement spending, which is things that pensions, health care for senior citizens, for older citizens, because Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House, wants big reforms there. President Trump, during the campaign, said, no, we're not touching entitlements. So it's a mixed bag.
Yeah, he says, I'm going to get big league spending cuts, but if you just go after the bills that are annually passed, that's actually about 1/4 of the whole U.S. budget if you leave defense alone. Defense is another fourth, and he says he won't touch that. And half of it are these entitlements Tom is talking about, and Trump has explicitly said he's going to leave those alone. And so it's not serious fiscal reform if you're only looking at 25%.
All right, so fiscal conservatives are still a bit uncertain. You just mentioned defense. I want to ask about this group, the defense or national security conservatives. Where are they?
Well, it is a mixed bag where you've had some of these people who they have high respect for. If you're looking at sort of the more hawkish conservatives, they are a fan of James Mattis. They have been uneasy with some of Trump's closeness with Russia, a lot closer than George W. Bush was or than Obama was at the end of the term. And as far as the Iran talk, that's a really big deal for a lot of the hawkish conservatives. Trump, I think, is pleasing them on that. But on the other stuff, he's such a question mark. We don't know where he's going to come down on his anti-terrorism policy, on his other international policies, that everybody's just kind of nervous because he doesn't have a record on this.
Okay, very good. Fascinating discussion. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us on Dakhel, Washington. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول الإيديولوجية السياسية للرئيس دونالد ترامب، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhura.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.